The ballroom glittered with money. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while executives in tailored suits moved through the crowd with practiced confidence. Every conversation sounded important. Investments, mergers, market predictions. The entire evening revolved around power and status, and he loved every second of it. The billionaire walked through the finance gala like he owned the room, shaking hands, laughing loudly, making sure every important guest noticed him. Nights like this fed his ego. The attention, the admiration, the attention, the admirer, feeling that people respected him the moment he entered a conversation. His wife walked beside him quietly. Elegant black dress, simple diamond earrings, calm expression, beautiful, but understated, formal 100. To most people there, she looked like what they expected from a billionaire's wife, graceful, supportive, silent. And he preferred it that way. Stay close, he muttered casually while greeting a group of investors near the entrance. She nodded slightly, already used to his public behavior. At home, he could be charming when he wanted to be. But around wealthy people, something changed in him. He became louder, sharper, constantly performing for attention. He had stopped reacting to it long ago. The evening continued as expected. Business leaders gathered around expensive tables, while servers carried champagne between conversations. Every few minutes, someone approached him with compliments or questions about investments. He enjoyed answering loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. His wife mostly listened, observing the room quietly. Eventually, a discussion near their table turned toward market trends and portfolio management. A senior investor spoke confidently about risk analysis while others nodded along, pretending they fully agreed. Then one older executive smiled politely toward her. "And what's your opinion?" he asked kindly. Before she could answer, her husband chuckled under his breath. "Trust me," he said while Trust me, he said while waving a hand dismissively. Finance isn't exactly her thing. Few guests laughed politely. She remained calm. The investor looked uncomfortable but smiled anyway. Smart in other ways, the billionaire continued with a grin. "Just numbers." More awkward laughter followed. She lowered her eyes briefly toward her glass but said nothing. Most people would have defended themselves. She did, and somehow that made the moment feel worse. One woman near the table shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure she understands more than you think," she said softly. "Poor sure comforter mordworm." "I'm sure she understands more than you think," she said softly. The billionaire smirked confidently. "If she handled investments herself, we'd probably lose half our money in a month." Now even the forced laughter disappeared. Several guests looked away, because it no longer sounded like teasing. It sounded cruel. Still, his wife stayed composed. No anger, no embarrassment, just silence. That silence slowly started making him uneasy, though he didn't fully understand why. The younger investor tried to change the subject. "So what do you actually do?" he asked her carefully. First time that evening she looked up directly. "I work in portfolio management," she answered calmly. Her husband immediately laughed again. "Small portfolios," he corrected casually before taking another sip of champagne. Then a voice behind them suddenly interrupted the conversation. "Not exactly." The group turned instantly. An older man stood nearby holding a champagne glass, staring directly at her with visible surprise. And the moment he recognized her, the entire energy around the table began to change. The older investor stepped closer, still staring at her in disbelief. For a moment, nobody spoke. The billionaire looked confused by the sudden tension in the man's expression. "Do you two know each other?" asked casually. The investor ignored the question at first. Instead, he looked directly at her. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight," he said respectfully. She gave a small polite nod. "Oh. Good to see you again, Inkle." That single exchange immediately changed the atmosphere around the table, because respect like that didn't happen accidentally in rooms filled with powerful people. The billionaire frowned slightly. "How exactly do you know my wife?" The older man looked genuinely surprised. He asked. "You're serious?" he asked. A few guests exchanged confused glances. The billionaire forced a laugh. "What am I missing here?" The investor slowly turned toward the group. "She manages one of the most successful private investment funds in the country." Silence. The billionaire blinked once. Performing. Silence. The billionaire blinked once. "What? She's been outperforming major firms for years," the investor continued calm. "Half the people in this ballroom follow her market decisions." Nobody moved. The billionaire stared at his wife, waiting for her to deny it. She didn't. Instead, she simply took another quiet sip from her glass. One executive near the table suddenly straightened in shock. "Wait, are you talking about the Hawthorne Fund?" The older investor nodded immediately. Now several faces changed at once, because everyone in finance knew that name. The Hawthorne Fund wasn't just successful, it was legendary for turning struggling investments into massive profits with almost impossible consistency. And very few people had ever met the person behind it. She's the founder? Someone whispered. The billionaire laughed nervously. No, that's impossible. The older investor looked directly at him. Putu, Worf, your wife built that company herself. The room fell completely silent. Even nearby conversations started fading as people noticed the sudden tension around the table. The billionaire slowly turned toward her again. Why didn't you tell me this? For the first time all evening, she looked directly into his eyes without hesitation. You never asked. That answer hit harder than anyone expected. Because deep down, everyone knew it was true. He spent years talking about himself, his businesses, his investments, his success, but he never stopped long enough to truly learn about hers. One woman near the table looked stunned. How much is the fund worth? The older investor gave a small smile. Last estimate, several billion. A quiet gasp spread across nearby guests. The billionaire's confidence visibly cracked for the first time that night. And last quarter alone, the investor added carefully, her personal earnings were nearly triple yours. Now the silence became unbearable. The billionaire looked around the table, realizing every person there had just watched him publicly humiliate someone far more successful than himself. And worst of all, she never once tried to embarrass him back. That realization began settling heavily into the room. One executive suddenly laughed awkwardly. Well, I guess she understands numbers after all. Nobody else laughed, because suddenly the earlier jokes didn't feel funny anymore. They felt they felt ugly. The billionaire loosened his tie slightly, clearly struggling to recover control of the moment. Meanwhile, his wife remained completely calm. No smug smile, no revenge, no need to prove anything. That quiet confidence somehow made the entire situation even more painful for him. Because for the first time all evening, the most powerful person at the table wasn't the loudest one. It was the one who never needed attention to begin with. The atmosphere around the table never fully recovered. Even though conversation slowly restarted across the ballroom, everyone nearby kept glancing toward them, whispering carefully behind champagne glasses. News traveled fast in rooms filled with wealthy people, and within minutes, more guests began realizing exactly who she was. The billionaire felt it immediately. The same executives who spent the evening focused on him were suddenly paying attention to her instead. Not because she demanded it, because her reputation already carried weight far beyond the room. One investor approached carefully with visible respect. I followed your fund for 3 years, he admitted. Your recovery strategy during the market crash was incredible. She smiled politely. Thank you. More politely. Thank you. Another executive joined the conversation. Your renewable energy investments changed the entire sector. Again, she answered calmly. No bragging, no performance. Just confident. The billionaire stood beside her quietly, watching the shift happen in real time. The first time that evening, he wasn't controlling the conversation anymore, and he hated how uncomfortable that made him feel. One man near the table laughed nervously. You really kept this hidden from everyone? Before she could answer, the older investor replied for her. She doesn't advertise herself, he said. That's part of why people trust her. The sentence stayed in the billionaire's mind, because he suddenly realized something painful. Everything he worked so hard to project naturally existed in her without effort. Respect, influence, authority. And unlike him, she never needed to announce it. He glanced at her quietly while others spoke around them. Exactly the same as she had earlier in the evening. Same calm expression. Same composed posture. She looked exact harsh or amount. Same calm its posture. The only thing that changed was how people saw her. That realization made his chest feel tight. Eventually the crowd around them thinned slightly, giving him a moment alone with her near the edge of the ballroom. I didn't know, he said quietly. She looked at him calmly. Jag Sorskensbrinch for Rav Dodov calmly. No, he continued, shaking his head slightly. I really didn't know. There was something different in his voice now. Not arrogance, not performance, just honesty. Bunkoabe remained silent, waiting. How long? He finally asked. 8 years. His eyes widened slightly. 8 years? She nodded once. I started before we got married. That answer hit even harder. Because it meant while he spent years building his image as the successful one in the relationship, she had quietly surpassed him financially without ever making it a competition. You never corrected me, he said soft. First time, a small sadness crossed her expression. You were never interested in listening, she replied. Silence settled heavily between them. Not angry, just truthful. Across the ballroom, laughter and music continued, but none of it reached him the same way anymore. The entire night now felt different, like someone had suddenly removed a mirror he'd been staring into for years. He thought back to every joke he made at her expense, every moment he dismissed her opinions during conversations about business, every time he assumed silence meant lack of intelligence. And standing there now, he realized something painful. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she didn't need validation from people who underestimated her. The billionaire lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. I embarrassed you tonight, he admitted. She studied him for a moment before answering softly. No, she said. That surprised him. Then she added the part that hurt most. You embarrassed yourself. Her words stayed in his mind long after the music faded into the background. You embarrassed yourself. Simple. Calm. Honest. And somehow more painful than if she had shouted at him in front of everyone. The billionaire stood silently beside her while guests continued moving through the ballroom, but now the entire evening felt different. Earlier, he walked through the finance gala believing he was the most admired person in the room. Now he wasn't even sure people respected him at all. Because admiration built on ego suddenly felt weak compared to the quiet respect his wife carried naturally. Across the ballroom, more investors continued approaching her. Some asked questions about market strategy. Others thanked her for advice she had shared years earlier during difficult financial periods. Every conversation confirmed the same thing. She wasn't secretly successful. She was legendary in their world, and he never even noticed. One senior executive shook her hand carefully. Your work helped save our firm during the downturn, he admitted sincerely. She smiled politely. I'm glad it worked out. The billionaire watched the interaction quietly. No arrogance. No need to remind people how important she was. Meanwhile, he spent years trying to convince rooms full of strangers that he mattered. That realization hit him harder with every passing minute. Eventually, the crowd around them faded again. This time he spoke before the silence could settle. Why stay with me? He asked quietly. The question surprised even him. She looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. Because I loved who you were before money became your personality, she answered softly. The sentence landed like a weight on his chest, because deep down, he knew exactly what she meant. Trommel peg. She peg. There was a time when he laughed naturally, when ambition motivated him without turning into arrogance. When he cared more about people than appearances, somewhere along the way, that version of him disappeared. And he hadn't even realized. Hayden realized it'd be it all. I didn't see it happening, he admitted quietly. No, she replied gently. Most people don't. For the first time that night, he stopped worrying about the guests watching them. Stopped caring about status, image, or embarrassment. None of it mattered anymore. Because the person he underestimated most had just revealed the truth about him more clearly than anyone ever had. The older investor from earlier approached once more before leaving the gala. You're lucky, he told the billionaire honestly. The billionaire frowned slightly. Why? The man glanced toward his wife. Because very few successful people stay humble after becoming powerful, he said, and even fewer stay kind after being disrespected. With that, he walked away. The billionaire stood silently beside his wife as the meaning settled deeply into him. She could have humiliated him publicly. She could have exposed him the moment he mocked her. Instead, she stayed calm, graceful, patient, not because she was weak, because she was secure enough not to prove herself. That difference changed everything. Slowly, he turned toward her again. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He said quietly. This time, the apology sounded real, no audience, no performance. Studied his face carefully, as if deciding whether the man standing in front of her was finally being honest with himself. Then she gave a small nod, not complete forgiveness, but acknowledgement, and as the finance gala continued around them, the billionaire finally understood the lesson that would stay with him long after the night ended. The smartest person in the room usually isn't the loudest one. The smartest person for one. What? Sometimes, it's the person everyone underestimated from the beginning.